From getting executed while buying a pair of socks to mysteriously combusting in a maximum security cell, this is how every major gang leader met their end. Stay tuned, because the last one will leave you speechless. It might also include some life-changing stress tips. Anyway, first up is Stanley Tookie Williams. In 1971, Tookie co-founded the Crips in Los Angeles alongside Raymond Washington. At first, it was a neighborhood protection group, but it quickly turned into one of the most violent and widespread gangs in American history, once power, territory, and profit entered the picture. One day, they were protecting the block. The next, the block was being protected from them. By the 70s, the Crips had fractured into dozens of sets spreading across LA and beyond. Tookie was known for his size, his strength, and his willingness to use extreme violence. He commanded respect through fear, but by 1979, his violence escalated to murder. On February 28, 1979, he walked into a 7-Eleven in Whittier, California, and shot the store clerk, Albert Owens, in the back with a shotgun during the robbery. 2 weeks later, on March 11th, he murdered a young couple and their daughter during another robbery. Are we seeing a theme here? Police arrested him soon after, and he was convicted in 1981 on 4 counts of murder. The evidence was overwhelming: ballistics, eyewitnesses, and even his own boasts to fellow gang members. Not a smart move. He was sentenced to death and transferred to San Quentin, where he would spend the next 24 years on death row. But something strange happened during those decades. Tookie changed, or at least claimed he did. In the late 90s, he began writing children's books, warning kids about gang life. He co-authored anti-gang materials and was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize multiple times. Celebrities, activists, and religious leaders all rallied behind him, arguing he'd redeemed himself and deserved forgiveness. Let's get this straight. 4 murders? Founded one of America's most violent gangs? But wrote some children's books, so Nobel Prize? Okay. Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger wasn't convinced. In December 2005, after reviewing the case, Schwarzenegger denied his final appeal, pointing to the brutal nature of the murders and noting Tookie's refusal to apologize or provide actual information about gang violence. Yet, Tookie maintained his innocence, which didn't really make sense considering the evidence. He would remain locked up. On December 13, 2005, Stanley Tookie Williams was strapped to a gurney inside San Quentin State Prison's execution chamber. Inside, the room was cold, clinical, and quiet. Williams had spent 24 years on death row, and now his final moments had arrived. At midnight, the lethal injection process began. First came sodium thiopental, a substance meant to render him unconscious within seconds. The second drug, pancuronium bromide, paralyzed his muscles, including his diaphragm, making it impossible to breathe. The sensation would have been suffocating, like drowning on dry land, but the paralytic prevented any outward signs of distress. Finally, a lethal dose of potassium chloride, a medicine in the right situation, stopped his heart. At 12:35 a.m., more than half an hour after the procedure began, he was pronounced dead at 51 years old. His execution became one of the most controversial death penalty cases in American history. But his death didn't end the Crips. The gang is still active today, with an estimated 30,000 to 35,000 members operating across the United States. His legacy remains split. Hero to some, cold-blooded killer to others. Up next is Peter Jaggers. Peter Jaggers was not just another street criminal. By the time he disappeared in 2024, he had established himself as a recognized gang boss connected to the Terrible Jobsters, one of Cape Town's most feared criminal networks in South Africa. He controlled operations across parts of the city and had built a reputation that commanded respect and fear in equal measure. In Cape Town's underworld, Jaggers was a known figure. Police had been tracking his movements for years. He operated with the kind of confidence that came from having power and connections. But in 2024, something went very wrong. On the day he disappeared, Jaggers flew from Cape Town to Johannesburg. One-way trip, as it turned out. After landing, he and his associate, William Peterson, checked in at a hotel nearby. According to police reports, he was attending a meeting with William Peterson at that same hotel when the kidnapping occurred. This was not a typical gang incident. Something went terribly wrong. And it wasn't just the room service. Soon after, reports began emerging that he had been kidnapped, and the details that followed were even more disturbing. There were claims of ransom demands, and also rumors that a Colombian cartel was involved in his abduction. But nothing concrete about his situation. On October 11, 2024, 2 male bodies were found floating in the Vaal River in the Free State province of South Africa. The men were apparently submerged underwater with chains and sandbags, and their bodies were in a state of decomposition. Whoever did it really wanted them to stay down there. Didn't work out, did it? One of the men was later identified as Peter Jaggers by his wife, Shawal Jaggers. The other man was his associate, William Raymond Peterson, who disappeared along with him. They had now been missing for 3 months. The Hawks, South Africa's elite investigation unit, took control of the case. The discovery confirmed what many had feared. It was an execution. A cartel execution. South African gang violence was nothing new, but international cartel involvement suggests the criminal landscape had evolved far beyond local wars. If cartels from South America were now operating in South Africa and backing local gangs and criminal networks, it meant the country's organized crime problem had entered a new dark and dangerous phase, and not the good, really cool movie kind. News spread quickly as major news outlets picked up the story. Social media erupted with theories, photos, and unverified claims. Imagine that. In cases like this, separating fact from speculation becomes nearly impossible until authorities release official information. Remember, this is modern times, not back in the 80s. But this didn't answer the most important questions. Who ordered the kidnapping? Was a ransom demanded or paid? How deeply embedded are international cartels in South Africa's criminal networks? For now, only a very few know the truth about Peter Jaggers. Unlike Demetrius Holloway, he wasn't a typical street dealer. He was way more than that. Born on July 30th, 1958 in Detroit, Michigan, he built one of the most powerful cocaine distribution networks in the city during the crack epidemic of the 1980s. While other dealers flashed their wealth and drew attention, Holloway operated differently. He kept a lower profile, ran legitimate businesses as fronts, and positioned himself as a businessman rather than a gangster. Holloway's drugs flooded neighborhoods, destroyed families, and turned the city into a war zone. He capitalized on the chaos. It wasn't just selling drugs on corners. It was distributing cocaine across Detroit through an organized network that law enforcement struggled to keep track of. But here's what made him different. He understood the value of appearances. Holloway owned several sports apparel stores across the city. Because nothing says, I don't sell crack, like a fresh pair of gym shorts. Or even a unfresh pair of gym shorts. Those weren't just fronts. They were actual operating businesses that generated legitimate income. He filed tax returns, claimed earnings from his stores and gambling winnings, and presented himself as a successful entrepreneur. On paper, he looked clean, because it's money laundering, yeah? Behind the scenes, though, of course, the real money came from cocaine. He worked alongside other major dealers and organized crime figures who controlled different parts of the city's drug trade. Law enforcement knew what he was doing, but proving it was another matter entirely. As always, power attracts enemies. And by 1990, Holloway had made enemies. Whether it was a territorial dispute, a financial disagreement, or someone wanting to take over his operation, the details remain murky. On the afternoon of October 8, 1990, Demetrius Holloway was inside The Broadway, a men's clothing store at 1247 Broadway in downtown Detroit, just 2 blocks from the Detroit Police Headquarters. He was picking out a pair of Ralph Lauren polo socks at the front counter when 2 men approached him from behind. One stood outside while the shooter walked in. Holloway was shot twice in the back of the head. The shooters then left calmly. According to some witnesses, the gunman snapped his finger, said, "Got him," and walked out whistling, while his accomplice waited in a black BMW for their escape, just like in the movies. At the scene, Holloway was found with a handgun and about $14,000 to $17,000 in cash on his person. He died almost instantly at the scene, and no one else was injured. After years of investigation, Lester Little Less Milton and his younger brother Tommy Toe Tag, you can't make this up, Milton, were found guilty of the murder. They were arrested in January 1999 on murder charges brought by the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office, with Lester Milton already in prison for another robbery at the time. Both were convicted of the murder and were sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. But why did they do it? Good question. Well, they were simply hired hitmen, and to this day, no one knows exactly who ordered this hit. Demetrius Holloway was one of the key figures who shaped Detroit's drug trade in the 80s, while staying far away from the radar. But even that couldn't save him from a violent world of organized crime. And yes, Detroit's drug scene was so incredibly large, we have a second gang leader in this video, Richard Maserati Rick Carter. He was born on July 31st, 1959 in Detroit, Michigan. By the mid-80s, Carter had become a major role player in the city. He operated on the city's east side, moving serious weight and building a reputation that made his street name legendary. The name Maserati Rick stuck to him like glue, but the origin is debated. Some say it came from him rolling up to nightclubs in luxury cars, flashing wealth that most people in Detroit could only dream about. Others claim he simply loved Maseratis. Either way, the name fits, and he was the opposite of Holloway and his socks. He lived like a king in a city of ruins. Unlike some drug kingpins, Carter's name doesn't appear in widely available federal case files. Most of what's known about his operation comes from local histories, documentaries, street accounts, and law enforcement descriptions rather than official court records. He kept a lower profile legally, even if his street reputation was loud. He moved in the shadows, avoiding the spotlight that brought down so many others. But avoiding the feds didn't mean avoiding enemies. In the drug game, success breeds envy, and envy breeds violence. Someone wanted Carter gone, and they were willing to wait for the perfect moment, and they found that in the hospital room. On September 10, 1988, a gunfight erupted outside a business on Detroit's east side. Bullets flew, glass shattered, and when the smoke cleared, Maserati Rick lay bleeding on the pavement. He was still breathing when the paramedics rushed him to Mount Carmel Mercy Hospital, where doctors worked to save his life. He survived. Guards were posted outside his room, and his people were on alert. He was protected. I'd like to say he lived happily ever after, but you know why we're here. 2 days later, someone walked into his hospital room past his guys and the guards and shot him dead. A nasty sneak attack, ending the life of one of the most prominent dealers Detroit has ever seen. Carter's funeral became part of Detroit legend. Multiple accounts describe a custom coffin designed to look like a Mercedes-style vehicle. Note, not a Maserati. Reportedly costing between $16,000 and $17,000. A final display of the lifestyle he'd lived. Even in death, Maserati Rick made a statement. Died in style, buried in style. He wasn't the biggest name in Detroit's drug trade, but his manner of death became one of the most dramatic crime stories from that period. Now let's turn up the temperature, although our next gang leader might not appreciate that joke. Jim Brown, aka Lester Lloyd Koch. Who was Jim Brown? He wasn't just another gang leader. He built one of the most violent and powerful criminal organizations in Caribbean history, the Shower Posse. The name came from their signature style, showering their enemies with bullets. By the 70s and 80s, his empire stretched from the slums of Kingston to the streets of New York and Miami. Jim Brown's base of operations was Tivoli Gardens in West Kingston, one of Jamaica's most notorious neighborhoods. This wasn't just a gang territory. It was a fortress. The Shower Posse controlled every corner, every business, every person who moved through the streets. They ran cocaine and marijuana across international borders, moving product into the United States, Canada, and even the United Kingdom on a massive scale. But here's what made Jim Brown untouchable for so long: political protection. During his reign, gang leaders and politicians in Jamaica were both connected and partners. Tivoli Gardens was a stronghold of the Jamaican Labour Party. Jim Brown provided muscle, controlled voters, and kept order in exchange for political backing. Politicians looked the other way, while his organization committed murders and ran drug operations across Jamaica and the United States. U.S. law enforcement later described the Shower Posse as one of the most dangerous Caribbean crime syndicates in history. They weren't exaggerating. The gang carried out contract killings, eliminated rivals without hesitation, and spread terror wherever they operated. Jim Brown ruled through fear, and for years, No one could touch him. By 1990, however, the walls were closing in. The U.S. Department of Justice indicted Jim Brown on charges related to drug trafficking, murder, and racketeering under RICO laws. This means running or participating in an enterprise, quote unquote, through a consistent pattern of serious crimes. Jamaican authorities arrested him at the request of U.S. law enforcement and locked him up at the General Penitentiary in Kingston, one of the island's most secure facilities, while he waited extradition to the United States. But here's the problem. Jim Brown knew too much. He worked with politicians for decades. He had names, dates, transactions. If he decided to talk, he could bring down powerful people across Jamaica's government. Authorities feared what might happen if he testified. They needed to shut him up, and it had to be fast. On February 23, 1992, a fire erupted in a prison cell at the General Penitentiary in Kingston, Jamaica. In that particular cell was Lester Lloyd Coke, known on the streets as Jim Brown. He suffered fatal burn injuries and died in custody. The official ruling stated he died during the fire incident while waiting extradition to the United States. Prison fire, right before extradition. Totally an accident. Sure. No Jamaican government or independent forensic report made detailed findings about the cause of the fire or whether it was accidental, suicide, or an escape attempt, or deliberate. Absolute shocker. To this day, no criminal charges have been publicly brought against anyone for his death. But nobody believed it was an accident. The fire was too convenient. The timing too suspicious. A man who could expose political corruption and criminal partnerships suddenly dies in the cell before he can talk? Yeah, people weren't buying it. While in custody, violence continued to follow him. In February 1992, just weeks before his own death, his eldest son, Mark Ja T. Coke, was shot and killed. After his death, leadership of the Shower Posse passed to his adopted son, Christopher Dodas Coke, who later became internationally notorious and was himself extradited to the United States decades later. After the arrest of Dodas Coke in 2010, the centralized power of the Shower Posse dissolved, leading to fragmentation into smaller gangs and factions and effectively bringing an end to the empire Jim Brown had built. Man, setting up generational gangs that become international crime syndicates and organizations? Kinda hard. But not for the Yakuza. Masahisa Takanaka wasn't just a random gang member. He was the underboss for the Yamaguchi-gumi, Japan's most powerful crime syndicate, as he controlled operations across Western Japan and commanded thousands. For years, his strategic mind made him invaluable, but it also made him a target for other ambitious members of the organization. Inside the Yamaguchi-gumi, power was shifting. Why? Well, the legendary boss Kazao Taoka had died in 1981, and the legacy he left behind was tearing the organization apart. Takanaka's rise threatened the wrong people. Yet, despite this, by 1984 he was chosen as the fourth Kumicho, or supreme boss of the Yamaguchi-gumi, a promotion that came with exactly 0 retirement benefits and a dramatically reduced life expectancy. Many other underbosses were not happy, and by 1985, the Achiwa-kai, a breakaway faction led by Hiroshi Yamamoto, had declared war. What came next would be one of the bloodiest conflicts in Yakuza history. On January 26, 1985, Masahisa Takanaka was in Suita, Osaka, visiting the apartment of a woman with whom he was romantically involved. Date night in Osaka? What could go wrong? The location was believed to be private and low risk, but his movements had been leaked. Rival gunmen already knew exactly where he was. That night, Ichiwa-kai assassins stormed the building with no warning and no hesitation. They forced their way inside and opened fire at point-blank range as Takanaka and his lieutenants were waiting for an elevator. He was hit multiple times all over his chest and abdomen, and the shooters vanished before police arrived. However, Takanaka was still breathing by the time the authorities came, and he was rushed to the hospital. Unfortunately, he died a few hours later. His assassination ignited an explosive response. The Yamaichi War erupted immediately. Retaliatory hits spread like wildfire across Japan. Shootings, stabbings, bombings. For 4 years, both factions hunted each other without mercy. The violence only ended in 1989, Not because either side won, but because police pressure and sheer exhaustion forced the fragile truce, marking the end of the terrible reign of violence. Well, sort of. Because Yoshinori Watanabe Yamaguchi-gumi. After that war ended in 1989, Yoshinori Watanabe became the 5th Kumicho of the Yamaguchi-gumi, taking control of Japan's largest and most powerful Yakuza syndicate at the critical moment. The organization was still recovering from the bloody Yamaichi War, and Watanabe's leadership focused on rebuilding, expanding into new territories, and tightening control over lucrative operations like construction, gambling, and entertainment. You know, the classic ABCs of crime. Under his rule, the Yamaguchi-gumi grew to an estimated 20,000 members, making it larger than many small armies. He was credited with reorganizing the gang after the Yamaichi War. But Watanabe's tenure was marked by increasing government pressure. Japan's anti-organized crime laws grew stricter throughout the 1990s after the brutal wars and killings in the 80s. They were specifically targeting Yakuza finances, operations, and membership. At the same time, internal politics within the syndicate remained volatile. Rival factions struggled for power, and younger members questioned the old ways of doing business. In 2005, yes, after 14 years of leadership, Watanabe retired and handed leadership to Shinobu Tsukasa, stepping back from active control and maintaining influence as an elder advisor. His health had been declining for years. Heart problems, complications from a stroke, and other age-related issues gradually weakened him. Turns out being a Kimochu is stressful. Who knew? Managing 20,000 gangsters while dodging assassins and government raids doesn't exactly promote cardiovascular health. By the mid-2010s, he was living quietly, receiving medical treatment and rarely appearing in public. The man who had once commanded one of the world's most feared criminal organizations spent his final years as an elderly patient, far removed from the power and violence that had defined his life. On December 1st, 2012, at the age of 77, Yoshinori Watanabe died from natural causes in a hospital. There was no assassination, no betrayal, no raid. He simply passed away from illness, having outlived most of his contemporaries and enemies, which is very rare in that line of business. That alone says everything. In an underworld where bosses are usually gunned down, stabbed, or quietly erased, Watanabe's survival was the exception. For 14 years at the top, no successful hit ever took him out. Whether because attempts failed, were never approved, or were never dared in the first place, the results were the same. Watanabe remained untouched. He didn't fall in a back alley or bleed out on the pavement. He died on his own terms. His funeral was attended by hundreds of Yakuza members in a public display that drew heavy police presence. Wonder why. But authorities could do nothing. He died of old age, avoiding the violent end that claimed so many others in his world. Watanabe's death symbolized a changing era for the Yakuza. The organization he had led was shrinking under constant legal pressure. Younger Japanese that were less willing to join, and the mystique that once surrounded the syndicates was fading. Basically, he was so successful after a brutal war in the 80s that the Yakuza had lost their same relevancy. And yes, his peaceful death in a hospital bed marked a clear break from the brutal killings that had defined earlier generations. Well, after that, I'm gonna go lock my front door. Please subscribe to keep me safe.